Young anatomists, this is our first lesson for Chapter 16 on the respiratory system. We're going to start with some gross anatomy and physiology. By the end of this video, you should be able to list and describe the steps needed for gas exchange, the main function of the respiratory system, and thinking from our form follows function analysis perspective, I want you to be able to identify and describe anatomical specializations of the different structures in the respiratory system. Of course, the primary function of your respiratory system is to exchange gases, bring oxygen to your tissues, and take carbon dioxide from your tissues. But the story is a little more complicated than that. The respiratory system also filters and warms up the air that comes into your lungs so it's less likely to damage your body. The respiratory system allows you to talk and make other vocal sounds. It's responsible for your sense of smell, and the respiratory system has a key role in blood pH homeostasis. Bringing gases in and out of your body collectively is called respiration, but there are some different steps with some different names that we want to make sure that we're keeping track of. Now, the part that you might think of as respiration is actually called ventilation. So ventilation is that breathing in and out, moving air in and out of your lungs. Now, it's important for us to distinguish between the respiration that's happening with your lungs and cellular respiration that we talked about a little bit earlier in the year when we talked about muscles. Now, external respiration is the gas exchange that happens between your lungs and your blood. So when you breathe in that air from the outside, the gas exchange of bringing oxygen in from your lungs and carbon dioxide out from your blood into your lungs, that's external respiration. And then those gases are in your blood. So gas transport throughout the body is step 3. Step 4 is internal respiration, where those gases are exchanged between your blood and your tissues. So blood drops off oxygen to the tissues and picks up carbon dioxide waste from the tissues. And then finally, we've got cellular respiration. So once those gases get to the cells in your tissues, what are your tissues going to do with it? Well, they're going to use oxygen to make ATP, and that process is cellular respiration and has a waste product of carbon dioxide. I really like this flow chart that shows those steps. Ventilation, bringing air into the lungs. Second, external respiration, where gas is exchanged between the lungs and the blood. Step 3, you can see where the gas is moving throughout the body and then gets to the tissues for step 4, internal respiration, where oxygen is dropped off and carbon dioxide is picked up, and then that oxygen stays in the cells at the tissues to make ATP by cellular respiration. So that was the basic physiology. Let's get to the basic anatomy. To help you chunk this information, the gross anatomy of the respiratory system can be broken down into 2 big parts: the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract includes the nose and nasal cavity up here, the pharynx, which is back here, and then the larynx, which is down in this area right here. Then we switch to the lower respiratory tract. And that's where you get to the trachea. The trachea splits into the bronchial tubes and into the lungs themselves, the upper and lower respiratory tract. So now we're going to take a journey through the upper and lower respiratory tract and just go through those structures each one at a time and talk about how their anatomical specializations relate to their specific functions to help the respiratory system as a whole. Well, first, of course, is your nose. Now, your nose filters out large particles from the air on the way into the body. And how does that happen? Well, of course, you have nostrils, and the air has to pass through the nostrils. So big things like bigger than your finger aren't going to be able to be breathed in. But your nose also has nose hairs to help catch other particles on the way in and keep them trapped in your nose. And of course, we've got boogers, and boogers are those particles that are being caught. And you can see that this guy is removing his nose hair, so he's taking away those anatomical specializations that are going to help him. So he actually might get sick from not being able to trap as many particles, from getting his nose waxed like that. Moving in through the nose, now we're at the nasal cavity. And hopefully you remember a little bit of this anatomy from our sense of smell. But the function, here written in blue, the nasal cavity helps warm and moisten air, and in addition helps trap any particles that are floating around in the air before it gets down into your sensitive lungs. What anatomical specializations are there in the nasal cavity? Well, it's made up of mucous membrane, so it's got sticky mucus in there to trap particles, and you could see that the mucous membrane also helps moisten the air. The reason that the mucous membrane is able to moisten the air and trap the particles is because, again, of that mucus that's very sticky and produced by these cells in the nasal cavity. In addition, there are cilia, or tiny hairs, that sweep the mucus down to the throat, and then you swallow that mucus, and your digestive system, the harsh pH and chemicals in your digestive system, kill any pathogens that get in through your nasal cavity. And then next, there's a lot of blood vessels in there. If you've ever had a bloody nose, you know all about that. And the purpose of having those blood vessels is to keep warm blood circulating around that area to help warm the air as it comes inside of your nasal cavity and moves towards your lungs. Next up is the pharynx. And the pharynx physiologically doesn't have like a big job except to connect everything together. You can see that the pharynx is made up of 3 different parts. Well, first of all, it's behind here, and the pharynx is this green, this blue, and this purple. And those 3 parts have different names. You can see that they all end in pharynx, so that's really nice. So we've got our nasopharynx, which is the section that connects right to your nasal cavity, the oropharynx, which is the part that connects to your mouth, and then the laryngopharynx, which is the part that connects down here to your larynx and to your esophagus. So this is how you're able to breathe through your mouth, and also if you laugh while you're drinking some water, how that water can shoot out of your nose. Moving down the line, the next structure is the larynx. The physiological functions of the larynx, written in blue, is that it helps keep foreign objects out of the trachea, the next tube in the line, and the larynx is where your vocal cords are, or your vocal folds that help you produce sounds, like the sound that I'm producing right now by talking. The anatomical specializations that help the larynx is that there are protective cartilages in there and muscles that you can see in here that really help protect the sensitive structures underneath. And this big old protective cartilage right here is called the thyroid cartilage, or your Adam's apple, and that sits right over your vocal folds so your vocal folds don't get damaged. Another critical structure in here is this one that's called the epiglottis, and the epiglottis is what slams your windpipe shut when you swallow. Let's take a different look at these structures. So we saw kind of like an anterior view in the last slide, and this view right here is like a mid-sagittal section, and then here we see like a view from the top, so a posterior view if they stuck like a camera down your throat to look at that larynx structure. So the larynx has these structures: the glottis, the true vocal folds, the false vocal folds, and the epiglottis. Let's check these out. And I really like this picture because we can see what's going on with the epiglottis and the glottis. So the glottis itself is actually made up of the true vocal folds, or true vocal cords right here. Those vibrate to help you produce sound. So when air passes over, they vibrate, and I'd recommend watching a video of that just to see how they work, especially maybe in like a singer or something like that. Then there are these false vocal folds, or vestibular folds, and they cover this structure when they're swallowing. So together, the true and false vocal folds make up the glottis. And then over here, you can see the epiglottis. It's also in this diagram, but it's really hard to get a sense of what the epiglottis does. So when you swallow after you eat food, to keep your food from entering your lungs, the epiglottis will slam shut, covering up the trachea and the glottis, and keeping food diverted down the esophagus instead of down the trachea. Next in line is the trachea, or the windpipe, you might know it as. The job of the trachea is to connect the larynx, that last structure we are at, to the next structure in line, the bronchial tree. And one really cool anatomical specialization of the trachea is that it has these cartilaginous rings to keep this tube open. Because of the way that pressure works in your lungs, if it didn't have these cartilaginous rings, every time you breathed, this tube would collapse and you'd essentially suffocate. I like this picture right here, which shows a trachea from a cat. See that little fur up there? So cats are commonly dissected to study anatomy and physiology, and you could really see these nice cartilage rings in here to keep that trachea tube open. Let's move down the line to the next structure. Now we've got our bronchial tree, and hopefully you can appreciate why it's called a tree. It kind of looks like an upside down tree where the trachea forms the trunk and then things start branching off. And here are the different levels of the bronchial tree. So structure A is the trachea. A branches into the primary bronchi. So that would be structure C. The primary bronchi branch into secondary bronchi. The secondary bronchi branch into tertiary bronchi, and so on. And hopefully that makes sense. Primary, secondary, tertiary. And as you can see down here, sometimes they're called different names. So secondary bronchi are sometimes called lobar bronchi. Tertiary bronchi are sometimes called segmental bronchi. And then after about that level, after about the tertiary level, then they just start to be called bronchioles, which means like little bronchi. And then finally, you get to alveolar ducts and then to alveoli. So this is a nice little flow chart that helps us keep track of all these anatomical levels. So that last diagram didn't show us those final levels very well. So this would be kind of like a bronchiole down here. And then the really small tubes would be our alveolar ducts. And then finally, we get to the alveoli, which are these things that look kind of like clusters of grapes. The alveoli is the site of external respiration. It's the destination point for that air that you breathe. And this is that, remember, external respiration is when oxygen goes from the lungs into the blood and carbon dioxide goes from the blood back into the lungs. And you could see that these clusters of air sacs here are all hollowed out inside, which gives a lot of surface area. And there's a lot of opportunity for contact between the walls of the alveoli, which are very, very thin to help gases pass through, and the capillary beds. It looks like it's completely spiderwebbed in capillary beds, and that allows that gas exchange between the blood and the lungs. Now, finally, the lungs themselves. We've actually been talking about the lungs for the last couple of slides because the bronchial tree branches are part of the lungs. So as soon as that trachea is exited, now we're in the lungs. So we've got the bronchial tree branches, plus the alveoli, plus the capillaries. And the only part we didn't really talk about was the elastic connective tissue of the lungs. In class, you're going to have an opportunity to touch some lungs and feel the elasticity of that lung tissue. That's really different than other tissues. We're going to talk about why this anatomical specialization of elastic connective tissue helps with lung function in just a couple of slides. Now, one thing that's really weird is that your lungs aren't symmetrical. You can see over here is the right lung and the left lung. The right lung has 3 lobes and the left lung has 2 lobes. Now look at the names of these lobes and hopefully it makes sense. So superior means kind of on top or towards the head. So you can see both lungs have a superior lobe, and then that would mean that both lungs have an inferior lobe as well. So you could see those right there. The right lung, since it has 3 lobes, it has a middle lobe as well between the superior and inferior lobes. That's how you can tell the left side from the right side. Now let's finish off this video by talking about what has to happen in order for air to get into your lungs and air to get out of your lungs. Bringing air in is technically called inspiration, and it involves the coordination of a lot of different structures. First, is your diaphragm, this dome of muscle that divides your thoracic cavity from your abdominal cavity. And what happens is when the diaphragm contracts, it actually moves down. Now, the diaphragm works in concert with some muscles called external intercostal muscles. Those external intercostal muscles, it's called external because it's on the outside of your ribs. So it's kind of between your ribs, but on the outside. And when those muscles contract, they bring your ribs outwards. And together, those two things of dropping the bottom out and bringing those sides outwards, that increases the volume of the thoracic cavity, and that is what forces the air in. So this cavity becomes lower pressure than the air in the atmosphere, and air just comes right in. Now, what has to happen for you to breathe out? Breathing out is called expiration, and that involves relaxation of muscles. So the diaphragm relaxes, and then the diaphragm pushes back up. Now, this is where that elastic tissue comes into place with the lungs. So when everything relaxes, when the diaphragm relaxes, those external intercostal muscles relax, the lung tissue, because of what it's made of, is going to want to snap back to its original shape, and then that's going to force air out. There's now higher pressure in the thoracic cavity than in the atmosphere outside. Now, you know that you can just breathe out, but you can breathe out all of the air. And if you're forcing out extra air, now there's some other muscles that will contract as well. And those are the internal intercostal muscles. Still between the ribs, so intercostal muscles, but they're on the inside. And so when they contract, they bring those ribs in even more and force more air out. All right, that's it for the gross anatomy and physiology of the respiratory system. My guess is that you're feeling okay about this, but you need some more practice. Make sure to take advantage of all of the practice opportunities in your book and in the class to really cement this information into place.